Subscribe to the channel and be part of the community of warriors who don't give up.
There are moments when anger strikes like lightning cutting across a calm sky. 1 second, everything feels peaceful. The next, your heart races, your muscles tighten, and sharp words escape before you even have time to think. He knew that feeling all too well. All it took was a careless remark, a disrespectful gesture, or even a look of disdain, and something would explode inside him. And every time it happened, regret would soon follow. Why did I let them get to me again? Anger always demanded a price. Broken conversations, heavy silences, strained relationships, but above all, the terrible sense that he was not in control, that those who provoked him were the ones holding the steering wheel of his life whenever he reacted without thinking. But what if there was another way? What if anger wasn't an inevitable sentence but a signal, a reminder that he could choose to act differently? That question kept echoing until he discovered the wisdom of the Stoics, men who had faced betrayal, injustice, and even cruelty, yet refused to hand their emotions over to the power of others. Marcus Aurelius had written, "You will not be harmed, but you will think you are harmed." Epictetus taught, "When someone offends you, realize that it is your judgment that offends you." These weren't just philosophical phrases, they were survival strategies. That's when he found a simple but powerful technique, a way to never again be consumed by anger, even in the face of provocation. It wasn't about pretending emotions didn't exist, but about learning to master the moment between the spark and the flame. If you've ever felt like a prisoner of your own temper, if you've ever wished to stay calm while others lost control, this message is for you. And before we go deeper into this story, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel. Here, we turn ancient wisdom into practical tools for modern challenges. If this resonates with you, you'll want to stay with us for what comes next. At first, he still believed that anger was inevitable. It felt like a natural reflex, almost instinctive. When someone disrespected him, it was as if his body reacted before his mind, firing sharp words or abrupt gestures. But little by little, he began to realize something important. Between the stimulus and the reaction, there was always a space. A small, almost invisible instant. And it was exactly there that freedom lived. It was in that space that he decided to act differently. Instead of responding in the heat of the moment, he began to take a deep breath. 3 seconds. That was all. 3 seconds that once seemed meaningless now became the key to breaking the cycle. Because in those 3 seconds he was able to choose. And when he chose, he was no longer a slave to anger. The technique was simple. When provoked, don't react immediately. Breathe. Give your body time to calm down, your heart time to slow, and your mind time to regain control. That pause, small but powerful, was like a bridge between impulse and reason. He noticed that when he breathed, the anger lessened. It didn't vanish completely, but it lost its grip. It was like a fire dying out for lack of air. And in that moment of calm, he could remember something essential. He was not obliged to take offense. He could choose not to carry the poison others tried to pour onto him. The Stoics had been teaching this for centuries. Epictetus said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but the opinions we hold about them." The insult does not enter you on its own. It's you who opens the door. The pause, the silence, and the breath were his way of keeping that door closed. That's when he discovered that mastering anger was not a matter of brute strength, but of intelligence, and that the greatest victory was not over others, but over himself. With time, he realized that anger wasn't just a passing emotion, but a silent thief. Every time he let it take over, he lost more than just his calm. He lost energy, focus, and even opportunities. Because while he was burning himself out in arguments, he was neglecting what truly mattered. So he began to use provocation as training. Every insult, every sideways glance, every unfair situation became a test of self-control. It was no longer about what others did, but about how he chose to respond. And each time he managed to hold back his reaction, he felt stronger, as if he were lifting invisible weights that were strengthening his mind. He understood that anger is like fire. If you throw gasoline on it, it spreads and destroys. If you observe it calmly, it dies out for lack of fuel. Breathing, silence, and conscious choice became his way of putting out the blaze before it consumed everything. Marcus Aurelius once said, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." That phrase echoed in his mind every time someone tried to provoke him. Not reacting didn't mean accepting injustice, but refusing to be shaped by someone else's behavior. The victory was silent, yet powerful. And that's how he discovered that true freedom wasn't living without provocation, but living without being controlled by provocation. Once he understood this, he realized there was nothing left anyone could use against him. One of his greatest lessons was realizing that anger was often nothing more than a wounded ego. When someone challenged him or mocked him, it wasn't really the insult that hurt. It was the feeling of not being respected, of not being recognized. It was pride screaming, "You can't let this go." But the Stoics taught that the ego is a cruel master. Whoever lives only to defend their image lives in constant war. And he decided he no longer wanted to be a slave to that invisible battle. He learned to separate two things: what others say and who he truly is. Once in a meeting, someone made a sarcastic comment about his ability. Everyone expected him to explode. But instead, he took a deep breath and calmly replied, "You're free to think whatever you want. What defines me are my actions, not your opinion." The entire room went silent. There were no shouts, no insults, only serenity, and a clear lesson for everyone present. He realized that when anger shows up, it comes with an illusion, the idea that we must react to prove something. But the truth is the opposite. Real power lies in not needing to react. Silence and self-control speak far louder than any words spoken in anger. The simple technique wasn't just to breathe and wait, but also to remember a profound truth. No one can take away your dignity without your consent. When you refuse to be offended, you dismantle the other person's game. Little by little, he began to notice something powerful. Anger didn't disappear because the world had become more just, but because he had become stronger. The provocations continued, the spiteful comments still appeared, and even unfair situations arose along the way. The difference was that now he was no longer a prisoner of those triggers. He discovered that mastering anger is not about putting out the fires of the world, but about learning not to be burned by them. Each time someone attacked him, he reminded himself, "If I react, I hand over my power. If I choose silence and calm, I remain in control of myself." Once, a colleague tried to expose him in front of everyone with a sharp, cutting criticism. He felt the heat of anger rising, but he also felt the space between impulse and response. He breathed, he smiled, and he answered only with action. He finished his part of the work with such excellence, so flawless, that the colleague was left speechless. In that moment, he understood. Silence, combined with competence, is the response that dismantles any attack. The Stoics had already said that the best way to overcome anger is not to let yourself be dragged by it. Because when you don't respond in the same tone, the aggressor loses control. He depends on your reaction to validate his attack. When you don't react, the attack dissolves into the air. That was the turning point, realizing that the simple technique of breathing, staying silent, and acting with serenity was more than a trick. It was a way of life. And the more he practiced it, the freer he felt. He began to see that anger was not only an emotion directed at others, but also against himself. Every time he exploded, he felt ashamed afterward. He replayed the scenes in his mind, imagining how different things could have been if he had chosen silence. It was as if he carried an emotional debt. Every outburst cost him days of regret. That's when he understood. Anger doesn't just harm relationships, it consumes the soul of the one who carries it. It steals sleep, corrodes health, drains energy. And when you realize this, it becomes clear that the greatest beneficiary of your calm is not the other person. It's you. One morning, after a heated argument that left scars at home, he decided firmly that he no longer wanted to live trapped in that cycle. The technique of breathing, pausing, and choosing became his daily discipline. It wasn't about being perfect, but about practicing until it became natural. Over time, every provocation turned into an alert. Instead of reacting automatically, he reminded himself, "Here is my chance to train." He was like a soldier on the battlefield. But the war was not against others, it was against his own impulsiveness. And with every silent victory, he felt he was rebuilding not only his peace, but also his dignity. The Stoics called this self-mastery, and they taught that the greatest achievement of a human being is not to conquer cities, but to conquer oneself. He was learning in practice that this was true freedom, not depending on the behavior of others to be at peace. Over time, he realized there was a huge difference between reacting and responding. Reacting was automatic, impulsive, driven by the heat of the moment. Responding, on the other hand, required awareness, pause, and intention. And it was this difference that changed everything. He began to choose carefully where he placed his energy. When someone provoked him, he would breathe and ask himself, "Is it worth it?" 9 times out of 10, the answer was no. It wasn't worth losing his calm. It wasn't worth giving away his control. It wasn't worth carrying the weight of anger. And hidden inside that no was his true victory. Once, someone tried to humiliate him publicly, expecting to see him lose his balance. But instead, he kept silent, finished his speech with serenity, and walked away with his dignity intact. The provocateur was left disarmed, and others didn't remember the insults. They remembered the calm with which he carried himself. It was living proof that silence has more impact than 1,000 angry words. That's when he understood that the simple technique wasn't just about avoiding fights, but about building respect. Because the world pays attention to those who can remain calm, while everyone else around them loses control. This is the kind of strength that doesn't need to be announced, only lived. The Stoics always taught that the greatest glory is not in defeating others, but in not being defeated by yourself. And he was learning this in practice. The more he practiced, the more he was surprised by the lightness of living without carrying resentment. With practice, he began to notice a subtle but powerful transformation. The calm that once felt like a conscious effort started to become natural. He no longer had to struggle as much against anger because he had learned to see it differently. Now, every provocation was almost like a disguised teacher, testing his discipline and strengthening his mind. He also realized that his change didn't affect only himself, but inspired those around him. Friends and colleagues who once saw him lose control began to ask, "How do you manage to stay so calm?" And his answer was always the same. "I just learned not to give others the power to decide how I feel." This new behavior started to generate respect. People trusted him more, sought his opinion in moments of conflict, because they knew they would find balance instead of outbursts. Self-control, which once seemed only like a defense against anger, had become a tool for leadership and influence. The Stoics said that virtue is contagious, and he experienced that every day. His calm inspired calm. His serenity helped to quiet tense environments, and what had once been an inner struggle was now becoming a gift to everyone around him. That's how he discovered that the simple technique of breathing, pausing, and choosing wasn't just a way to avoid anger. It was a path to becoming a living example. And nothing surprises more than someone who responds to chaos with peace. It was then that he realized the true victory over anger was not just silence in the face of provocation, but the building of an inner fortress. Little by little, he understood that he could not control the world, nor avoid difficult people or injustice. What he could do, and what no one could ever take from him, was to strengthen his own mind until nothing from the outside could bring him down. Each breath before responding was like placing another stone in that fortress. Each silence chosen was another brick. And every calm action in the midst of chaos was like raising invisible walls that protected his peace. It wasn't a barrier that pushed others away, but a safe space within himself, one no one could enter without his permission. He learned to see provocation as a test of endurance, not as a personal attack. If someone shouted, he breathed. If someone insulted him, he reminded himself, "The offense only enters if I open the door." That thought became his armor. Over time, he realized he was mastering not only anger, but also fear, anxiety, and even insecurity. Because when you understand that only you decide what enters your mind, the world loses its power over you. That's when he discovered the essence of the simple technique. Never getting angry again didn't mean living without being provoked. It meant never again handing his peace over to someone else's control. And that freedom was the greatest victory of all. In the end, he understood that anger had never really been the enemy. The enemy had always been the illusion that he needed to react to prove something. When he realized that, he felt free, because he discovered that life doesn't demand impulsive reactions but conscious choices, and that every provocation was nothing more than a disguised opportunity to grow. The people around him noticed the difference. Those who once saw him as explosive now saw calm. Those who expected fury found serenity, and that had more impact than any angry response ever could. It was no longer just about avoiding fights, but about becoming a living example of self-control. He discovered that the simple technique, breathe, pause, and choose, wasn't a passing trick but a way of life, a philosophy of freedom, dignity, and inner strength. Never getting angry again didn't mean never feeling the spark of provocation, but never again allowing that spark to become a fire. And that was the ultimate transformation, realizing that peace doesn't depend on the world, but on how you choose to respond to it. Anger may knock at the door, but you will always have the power not to open it. If this story spoke to you, remember, the true victory is not in defeating others, but in defeating yourself. And if you want to keep learning how to use ancient wisdom to face modern challenges, subscribe to this channel. Here we turn provocations into lessons, silence into power, and discipline into freedom.